We break into normal programming with a chilling revelation from behind the heavily guarded gates of Clarence House, where an unprecedented, clandestine power shift threatens to shatter the fragile foundation of the British monarchy. Behind closed doors, away from the blinding glare of press cameras and public fanfare, a calculated bid for control has been launched, a silent coup intended to strip the realm's most revered figure of her sacred legacy. This is not a mere dispute over charitable titles. It is an overt act of elite intrigue, a ruthless effort to seize absolute ceremonial authority while the crown reeled in a moment of profound personal vulnerability. The crisis ignited on an otherwise quiet morning when a sealed submission arrived at the desk of King Charles III. Flanked by his most trusted private secretaries, the monarch broke the red wax seal, expecting routine administrative proposals, or perhaps an olive branch to mend deep, agonizing family fractures. Instead, as the heavy parchment unfolded, an icy stillness settled over the room. The first page alone altered the trajectory of the reign. Laid out in cold, unyielding, legalistic prose was a formal demand from Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. She was not asking for a collaborative endeavor. She was demanding direct, immediate control over the Queen's covenant for children and families, a protected patronage forged in the final twilight years of Queen Elizabeth II and entrusted exclusively to Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The document was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It did not sound like a plea for charitable cooperation, but rather an indictment of Catherine's leadership. With surgical precision, Meghan's submission argued that the covenant desperately required a dynamic, globally recognized figure who could expand its reach far beyond the borders of Great Britain. The subtle, toxic implication was unmistakable. Catherine, currently recovering and maintaining a reduced public profile, was no longer capable of carrying the crown's future. To Charles, who had watched his late mother personally bestow this sacred trust upon Catherine, as a symbol of duty and eternal continuity, the document read as a grotesque desecration. Miles away, in the secluded sanctuary of Adelaide Cottage, Prince William delivered the news to his wife in absolute privacy. Catherine listened without interrupting, her face an unreadable mask of solemn grace. Yet, the delicate composure cracked the instant William admitted the submission's most cruel assertion, that Catherine's temporary absence had rendered the patronage vacant. She repeated the word once, her voice barely above a whisper, echoing in the quiet chamber. Vacant? Behind her quiet restraint, a deep, agonizing hurt took root. Her period of physical vulnerability and private suffering had not been met with empathy, but had been meticulously analyzed, weaponized, and reframed as an opportunity for her replacement. Back at the palace, a second, far more terrifying shock awaited the king as he scrutinized the confidential pages. Buried within the demand were technical phrases that matched, word for word, a restricted palace memorandum. It referenced a dormant continuity clause, a secret administrative mechanism designed exclusively for extreme royal emergencies to allow temporary stewardship. That document was locked within the deepest vaults of royal record, forbidden from outside eyes. Charles stared at the pages, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was no longer mere family ambition or emotional petulance. It was a coordinated, deeply briefed intelligence operation. Someone within the ancient architecture of the palace had fed confidential state apparatus secrets to Meghan to fuel her assault. When the private secretaries were finally dismissed, King Charles stood alone in the suffocating quiet of his study. He removed his spectacles with trembling fingers, pressing his knuckles hard against his brow as the full weight of the betrayal sank in. "She has crossed the boundary," he whispered into the empty room, his voice raspy with despair. "The one she was warned never to approach." Before the king could process his anguish, the heavy oak doors swung open. Prince William entered for an emergency audience, carrying no documents, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with absolute fury. The heir to the throne knew who had leaked the restricted language, and he was prepared to defend his wife's dignity at any cost. What had begun as an audacious request had transformed into an all-out war for the crown's honor. The conflict threatening the heart of the monarchy was not merely a dispute over administrative titles. It was a deeply personal clash rooted in 3 bleeding wounds. For Catherine, the Queen's covenant was a sacred trust, sealed in the reflective twilight of Elizabeth II's life, a lifelong promise forged in personal devotion to the nation's children. For Meghan, it represented the ultimate symbol of institutional exclusion. In her mind, earlier Commonwealth initiatives had been deliberately stripped away and redirected toward Catherine, turning this demand into an attempt to reclaim a global platform she believed was rightfully hers. Standing between them was King Charles, caught in the epicenter of a family fracture he had failed to heal, realizing his soft attempts at conciliation had only emboldened his adversaries. Within the dim corridors of Clarence House, Queen Consort Camilla saw the tactical brilliance of the trap being sprung. She warned Charles in hushed, urgent tones that an immediate refusal would be ruthlessly weaponized. Meghan's external team stood ready to spin a devastating public narrative, painting the palace as a cold hierarchy blocking a willing mother from serving vulnerable children across the world. "If you approve this," Camilla cautioned, "you betray Catherine and destroy William's trust forever. If you reject it, you allow them to portray you as a cruel, archaic monarch." Every option had been prearranged to inflict maximum structural damage upon his reign. Across the grounds, Catherine stood alone before an antique display cabinet holding the Covenant's original silver emblem. She stared at the silver artifact, but made no move to touch it. Her posture was erect, her composure absolute, yet the pain in her eyes was agonizingly clear. She turned to William and spoke with calm resolve, stating she would never engage in a public spectacle or fight for something the late Queen had placed in her care. William looked at his wife, his chest tight with unspoken fury. He assured her quietly that while she might refuse to fight, a faction operating deep within the old palace structure had already chosen to wage war upon her. To trace the origins of this intelligence leak, Charles was forced to look back to a solemn evening at St. James's Palace that everyone had tried to forget. During an annual Covenant gathering, Catherine had been absent due to her health, leaving an empty gilded chair at the center of the hall. Princess Anne had stepped forward to deliver remarks on Catherine's behalf, taking care never to claim the role itself. But that solitary, vacant seat became a silent magnet for ambition. Watching from afar, Meghan's team focused on that empty chair, interpreting Catherine's absence not as a medical pause, but as proof of institutional vulnerability. The key to the breach lay with Sir Malcolm Avery, a veteran palace advisor who had helped draft the Covenant's administrative framework decades earlier. Following the ceremony, Avery engaged in a loose conversation with an American charity executive, mentioning a dormant continuity clause that allowed the monarch to appoint a temporary steward during a royal absence. Those careless words crossed the Atlantic, where administrative nuances were transmuted into weapons of opportunity. Photographs of Catherine's empty chair were circulated among Meghan's consultants, who analyzed her illness as a tactical void waiting to be filled. William's private investigation uncovered an even darker reality. Meghan's legal team had contacted Sir Malcolm Avery 3 separate times, extracting confidential details regarding the Covenant's financial structures, governance bylaws, and ceremonial insignia. The submission presented to Charles had intentionally omitted a vital condition, that any temporary steward had to be a senior working royal acting under Catherine's direct authority. They had stripped away the restriction, reframing a protective measure into a vehicle for total usurpation. Summoned to Clarence House for a private accounting, Sir Malcolm Avery entered the king's study leaning heavily on a carved wooden walking stick. Under the oppressive weight of Charles's dark, silent gaze, the old courtier broke down, trembling as he admitted his indiscretion. When he was dismissed, Avery limped out, leaving his walking stick leaning against the arm of a velvet chair. Charles remained seated, staring at the forgotten cane in terrifying silence. A single man's loose tongue had handed their enemies the key to the vault, exposing the fragility of a historic legacy to ruthless ambition. The king ordered absolute secrecy, intending to handle the matter through private channels. But the crisis was accelerating beyond his control. Meghan had already arrived in London, stepping off a private aircraft, expecting immediate formal negotiations. She came not as a petitioner, but as a negotiator holding leverage, convinced the institution would fold under international scrutiny. The time for legal memoranda and polite correspondence had vanished. Inside a quiet, wood-paneled drawing room at Clarence House, with no cameras, no advisors, and no publicists present, the historic confrontation began. The air inside Clarence House felt suffocating under the weight of suppressed resentment as King Charles stood face to face with Meghan. Outside, no cameras flashed. Inside, no advisors offered polished compromises. Charles had stripped the room of institutional buffers, determined to force a direct confrontation. Meghan stood before him with weaponized composure, projecting the unwavering confidence of a strategist who believed victory was already hers. She spoke not in tones of petition, but of executive necessity, asserting that the Queen's covenant had been stifled by rigid tradition. She claimed she possessed the global influence, international donors, and modern vision required to rescue a struggling foundation, insisting that vulnerable children must not pay the price for the Crown's fear of modernization. Charles listened in brooding silence, his hand gripping the back of an antique chair until his knuckles turned pale. When she finally paused, the king delivered a single, razor-sharp question that pierced through her polished rhetoric. Why had Catherine never been consulted before this demand was filed? Meghan did not flinch. Without a trace of hesitation, her voice chilled the room as she delivered her ultimatum. Permission was hardly required from an individual whose prolonged inactivity had created the need for intervention. The words hung in the air like a poisoned dagger. A terrifying silence fell over the study. Charles pushed his chair back, his face darkening with a fury rarely seen by his court. The diplomatic restraint that had defined his reign evaporated in an instant. "You are asking for what was never yours," the king declared, his voice trembling with grave authority. "And you are using Catherine's pain to justify taking it." He reminded her that reduced public duty was not surrender, nor was quiet recovery an abandonment of sacred duty. Backed into a corner, Meghan unleashed her core justification, invoking a private conversation with Prince Harry. She claimed Queen Elizabeth had once intended to bestow a broad Commonwealth mandate upon her, framing this takeover as the rightful correction of a historic injustice, a platform denied to her by institutional gatekeepers. It was then that Charles delivered a devastating blow that shattered her confidence forever. He revealed a secret long buried in the palace archives. While the late Queen had indeed considered various roles, Elizabeth II had personally removed Meghan's name from the Covenant succession framework. The late monarch had explicitly cited grave concerns regarding the dangerous collision of royal authority with independent commercial branding. Meghan's expression froze, her rehearsed poise disintegrating in an instant. Before she could process the revelation, the heavy double doors swung open. Catherine stepped into the room, accompanied by Prince William. The Princess of Wales moved with an agonizing, quiet dignity. She looked directly at Meghan, offering no anger, no theatrical outrage, but a quiet, devastating truth. "Why was my work described as abandoned?" Catherine asked softly, her voice steady yet heavy with hurt, rather than temporarily reduced. In that moment, the balance of power shifted permanently. Meghan had no answer. Her elaborate strategy lay exposed not as a noble humanitarian intervention, but as a calculated exploitation of another woman's suffering. Charles ended the audience immediately, declaring that the Crown's moral authority would not yield to coercive pressure. Hours later, inside the quiet sanctuary of the Windsor Library, King Charles convened a historic conclave with Princess Anne and the keeper of the Privy Seal. Surrounded by centuries of state precedent, Anne unsealed Queen Elizabeth's final private instructions regarding the covenant. Reading the late Queen's precise, unyielding words, Anne confirmed that the patronage was entrusted to Catherine's character, not her temporary physical availability. The document contained an absolute prohibition. The covenant could never be transferred to anyone who had abandoned official royal duty or sought to blend royal titles with private commercial gain. Furthermore, evidence was presented revealing that Meghan's team had already prepared fundraising materials bearing the official royal seal before the king had even been consulted. Standing beside the tall, Gothic windows overlooking the mist-shrouded grounds of Windsor, Charles made his ultimate decision. The period of indecision was over. "There will be no negotiation over my mother's promise," the king declared. The heavy mahogany doors closed with a dense, vacuum-sealed click, shutting out the muted hum of the executive suite and locking two men inside an arena of polished marble and cold glass. Arthur Sterling did not rise from his leather armchair. He sat with his hands resting casually on the armrests, a crystal glass of amber liquid balanced loosely in his right palm. His expression was the picture of practiced magnanimity, the face of a man who had spent 4 decades dismantling lives from behind a desk without ever raising his voice. "You should not have come up here, Julian," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying the smooth authority that had once commanded boardrooms across 3 continents. "Courage is often mistaken for leverage. You possess the former in brief supply, but you have none of the latter. Sit down before you ruin what little remains of your career." Julian stood by the door, unmoving. His eyes were fixed on Arthur's face, searching for the smallest tremor in the elder man's posture. He held a simple black leather dossier under his left arm. No briefcase, no theatrics, just the weight of truth bound in calfskin. "There are no cameras running in this room, Arthur," Julian replied, his tone flat and devoid of anger. "No junior partners taking notes, no security detail behind the tapestry. I severed your internal communications 3 minutes ago. We are entirely alone." Arthur set his glass down with a sharp click. "A cheap trick. Power isn't proximity, Julian. It's infrastructure. If I push the silent alarm under this mahogany, 6 armed guards will remove you from this building before your feet touch the lobby." "Go ahead and push it," Julian said calmly, stepping to the center of the room. "Push it and explain to Chief Officer Reynolds why he should obey an order from a man whose personal offshore entities were frozen by the Federal Reserve at 7 o'clock. Arthur's fingers twitched against the wood. For a fraction of a second, his composure faltered, his eyes narrowing into tight slits. "Nonsense. The Cayman holdings are bulletproof." "They were," Julian corrected gently, "until your chief financial architect spent the last 6 hours in a windowless room at the district attorney's office. He didn't just give them account numbers, Arthur. He gave them encryption keys, signed vouchers, and recorded calls where you explicitly directed the liquidation of the employee pension reserve." Julian opened the black folder and laid a single sheet of paper face up on the desk. An advance copy of an unsealed federal indictment bearing Arthur's full legal name across the top line in bold typography. Arthur looked down at the document. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. The supreme confidence that had shielded Arthur for 40 years began to evaporate, replaced by a cold dread that started in his chest and crept down his limbs. "This is a desperate bluff," Arthur whispered, his voice losing its resonance. "You cannot burn this institution without burning yourself. You signed those compliance filings too." "I signed the filings you altered," Julian said. "And the forensic audit clearly shows the digital signatures were forged using my credentials while I was suspended. Every trail leads back to your private terminal. I didn't come here to negotiate terms, Arthur. I came to deliver the execution order." Julian leaned forward, resting his palms flat on the glass surface of the desk. "Here is your ultimatum. You will sign the unconditional resignation papers on the 2nd page. You will surrender all equity back to the trust without compensation. You will walk out through the side exit tonight, alone, and surrender yourself to federal marshals tomorrow morning." "And if I refuse?" Arthur sneered, a fleeting spark of his old venom breaking through his slipping facade. "If I fight you in every court from here to London?" "If you refuse," Julian said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper, "I hit send on a broadcast file containing 40 gigabytes of internal audio. The financial fraud, the systemic cover-ups, the blacklisted whistleblowers, the families you destroyed. By midnight, your legacy won't just be ruined, it will be erased. Your children will lose every asset tied to your name, and you will spend the rest of your life in a maximum security facility." Arthur stared at Julian, his breathing shallow and rapid. For the first time, he saw no hesitation in the younger man's eyes, only an absolute, terrifying neutrality. The dynamic that had governed their relationship for a decade had dissolved in an instant. The master was no longer in control. The quiet subordinate had become the executioner. Slowly, with hands that shook despite his desperate efforts to suppress the tremor, Arthur reached into his breast pocket and drew out his gold fountain pen. His knuckles were white. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scratch of the nib against parchment as he signed. The collapse of his empire took less than 5 seconds. Julian picked up the signed paper, checked the ink, and closed the folder. He offered no parting insult, no victory speech. The triumph of justice was silent, heavy, and final. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving Arthur Sterling sitting alone in the dim room, staring blankly at his empty hands as total defeat washed over him. The 6-paragraph formal refusal issued from Clarence House landed with the devastating force of a silent execution, reverberating through the gilded corridors of the royal household within minutes. It was not merely a procedural denial, it was a brutal institutional verdict. The document formally declared that Catherine had never ceased to hold the Queen's covenant, dismantling in a single stroke the false premise of vacancy that Meghan's strategy had relied upon. In her private London residence, Meghan received the news in heavy silence. She placed her phone face down on the polished table, her composure fracturing as she admitted to Harry that the palace had chosen Catherine's image over global reach. When Harry quietly asked if she had truly expected the king to strip his brother's wife of her sacred mantle, the cold silence that followed revealed the unspoken truth. This was never about administrative efficiency, but a ruthless test of who commanded the ultimate authority within the modern crown. Yet in the wake of her absolute triumph, Catherine offered no celebration, no public satisfaction, and no victory speeches. When presented with the restored covenant schedule, she closed the leather folder with solemn grace, explicitly instructing her staff that no palace statements were to attack or diminish Meghan. She understood that sacred promises could not be reduced to weapons of personal vengeance. Instead, she met privately with King Charles at Windsor to secure something far greater than temporary victory, a complete, binding rewrite of the covenant's protective charter. Under this new royal decree, no future monarch could ever misinterpret a royal's illness, pregnancy, or temporary absence as abandonment or surrender of duty. The loophole that had invited foreign ambition was permanently sealed, and Sir Malcolm Avery was quietly purged from all palace advisory boards, his access terminated forever. As images of the rejected application leaked to major international newsrooms, the court of public opinion delivered its brutal, unyielding judgment. Headlines across the capital heralded the patronage she could not take, contrasting Meghan's quiet, hasty departure from British soil with Catherine's triumphant return to South London, where cheering crowds greeted her with deafening applause. For Meghan, the failure was absolute. The prepared announcements were burned, the booked photographers cancelled, and the realization took hold during a final, somber conversation with Harry that the royal boundary was now permanent and impenetrable. The dream of seizing the late Queen's legacy had collapsed into a bitter, historical exile. In the quiet solitude of the Windsor apartments, King Charles visited the Princess of Wales after her first restored engagement. Standing before the ancient portraits of monarchs who had defended the crown through centuries of turmoil, Charles spoke the final, definitive words of this saga. "The promise is safe." Catherine looked at her sovereign and replied quietly, "Then the work can continue." It was a moment etched in the dark, unyielding fatalism of dynastic history, a reminder that while individual ambition may rise with loud sound and fury, the ancient machinery of the crown endures only through quiet loyalty, sacrifice, and unbreakable duty. Those who attempt to claim power through force find themselves erased by time, while those who carry its burden